Thank you very much, Chair Nalewajek. Eminences, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we have to address a solidarity paradox. A paradox. On the one hand, there is so much solidarity exercised by individuals, in families, in hospitals, in schools, in communities, but there are so large solidarity deficits between nations and for tackling the global issues of people's poverty and the planet's destruction. We must find ways to overcome this micro versus macro paradox of solidarity. Science and faith have a joint challenge here. I believe the Fondazione can help, your foundation can help overcome the solidarity paradox. 5 important encyclicals give guidance for how to address the global challenges of injustices, inequalities, and exclusion, and how to consider living in this changing world. They have already been mentioned, but I want to repeat them. Rerum Novarum on capital and labor, Centesimus Annus, emphasis on solidarity, Caritas in Veritate, on integral human development, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti. These encyclicals, you know, spanned 130 years. Their sequence and thematic focus is in itself a testimony to the growing challenges created by humanity, now impacting nature at a planetary scale in the age of the Anthropocene, the human-influenced planet. During these 130 years, science has progressed as never before in human history. Violence has escalated to many large wars and destructions like never before in these 130 years. And nature and our fellow species have been destroyed by human activities at a scale like never before, now putting humanity itself at risk due to climate change. These encyclicals all have a strong contemporary science base, connecting wisdom and knowledge, faith and science, social and natural science, when I speak of science. In Centesimus Annus, Pope St. John Paul II refers to the concept of solidarity, drawing on Pope Leo XIII as a principle of solidarity guiding the internal order of each nation and the international order. That's important to address the solidarity failures which we have. Lots of solidarity at the micro level, failure at the macro level. The philosopher Habermas considers solidarity to be always internal to some concrete community. However, the perspective of solidarity in Centesimus Annus, and even more so in Fratelli Tutti, clearly goes beyond this narrow concept of solidarity as applicable only to some concrete community. Only a broad perspective of solidarity, solidarity with all, overcomes an us versus them perspective. Poverty is a clear indication of solidarity failures. Poverty remains high, actually growing, and in the pandemic, and inequality increases in many countries. Against this backdrop of growing inequality, however, an additional concept needs to be considered. In addition to poverty and inequality, that concept is called relative deprivation. Relative deprivation is a comparison between the situation of an individual and a group comparing oneself with society. Feelings of relative deprivation undermine social cohesion and peace. Relative deprivation increasingly matters in a globally informed world of growing inequalities of wealth. I now want to address 5 action areas that can facilitate enhancement of solidarity, including at the macro scale where we have the solidarity deficits. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences has held conferences and published books on all these 5 issues in recent years. When I walked in, Eminence Cardinal Tagle said, "You are producing so many books. I haven't finished one and the next is already there." So still, I referred to our publications. I took it as a compliment from His Eminence. The first solidarity problem at scale I want to address is overcoming marginality and hunger and poverty. Hunger is caused by poverty, marginality, and exclusion, by environmental change, and increasingly by violent conflicts. Different types of solidarity deficits are part of the root causes. The recent United Nations Food Systems Summit, I believe my colleague from FAO will address it in more detail, concluded that science and innovations are critical to accelerate the transformation towards healthier, more sustainable, equitable, and resilient food systems. That's an important conclusion, the role of science to address this solidarity failure. But it needs to be financed. Essential are increased productivity, adding income and nutrition component to social protection programs, and slashing food waste and losses. However, a prime task for solidarity is to enhance peace, as well as to avoid episodes of self-destruction, whether by war, hot or cold, or by environmental devastation. In view of the high prevalence of violent conflicts in the world, we must note a major solidarity deficit. It was already referred to. Spending on arms is higher than on health and education. Solidarity for peace and solidarity in multilateral disarmament would free up huge resources for sustainable development. States, community, churches, the United Nations agencies can create and must create conditions for sustainable peace, enhancing food security. The second solidarity failure problem I want to address relates to the climate crisis and to achieve sustainable consumption. The two are closely connected. This problem will also not be overcome without solidarity at global scale. An integrated plan to drastically reduce climate change and air pollution is essential. To accelerate decarbonation, there should be effective carbon pricing, informed by estimates of the social costs of carbon, including the health effects of air pollution. But we need to be aware of potential equity implications of such carbon pricing, because it would also adversely affect the poor. The Faith and Science Initiative for COP26, with its joint appeal last month by science and faith leaders here in the Vatican from all main religions of the world, is an important step of collective action in this direction. Addressing climate crisis requires recognition of the need to change consumption behavior, reducing consumption-related emissions and increasing the share of investment in adaptation and in innovation. We need a concept of enough, an ethics of consumption. The whole set of instruments to trigger behavioral change need to be used. That includes not only better information, better science education, but also nudging, targeted taxation, regulations, and restrictions. We must not wait with these measures. The third area of solidarity I want to address is the solidarity with nature. Solidarity seems weak among people, but solidarity is almost absent with regard to the animals and the natural environment. Rights-based approaches should be expanded to animals, farm animals, welfare and wildlife, and protection of natural habitat and biodiversity protection. The Convention on Biological Diversity has not been particularly effective. The Global Biodiversity Framework, which will be debated spring next year at a global conference, needs to become more ambitious and needs to integrate the agenda related to nature with the agenda related to people, including indigenous peoples and future generations. The fourth solidarity challenge is a pandemic, and we had a wonderful discussion of that just by the Cardinal Tagle. Management of the pandemic and the vaccines. One of my granddaughters, her name is Freda, 2 years old, had COVID earlier this year. So of course the family came together in solidarity, supporting. And she's okay now. The COVID-19 crisis in principle put large parts of society at equal risks, but in reality very unequal outcomes because of lack of solidarity. Pope Francis pointed at that, stressing, this is a moment to see the poor. We used that phrase as a heading of an article in Science magazine. The science communities were fast with successful development of vaccines. But the distribution, as we heard already, materialized in a big solidarity failure. Our Academy addresses the issues, the ripple effects, the indirect effects of the pandemic next month, long COVID, the mental consequences, the economic consequences. Global health and climate change should be islands of consensus for joint action by the big nations, US, Europe, and China, for instance. Unfortunately, it does not look like it as we are approaching the climate conference, and does not look like it as we are trying to cope with the global COVID. Then we come to my last area where we need action, the fifth area of attention to solidarity. And that is with using artificial intelligence and robotics appropriately. This area shall be highlighted as it is at the core of modernization and innovation in our age. It will fail to serve solidarity if not appropriately managed. Artificial intelligence and robotics need to be regulated under human rights codex to protect people. Poor people that lose out due to AI and robotics in the labor market must be compensated. As such, the artificial intelligence robots is a means at the service of humans, nothing more. A vision of a system should be pursued that uses the wealth generated by AI and robotics to build a society that is more compassionate, strengthened by solidarity. Let me summarize. The 5 important encyclicals give guidance for how to address the global challenges of injustices, inequalities, and exclusion, and how to consider living in the changing world. To identify causes of solidarity deficits, the concept of relative deprivation is more and more important because people more and more compare themselves with others in the urbanized, increasingly globally informed, unequal world. Actions that may assist in enhancing solidarity in 5 key areas of humanity and protection of nature are solidarity for overcoming hunger and marginality, for overcoming the climate crisis and achieve sustainable consumption, solidarity with nature, including the animals, solidarity in pandemics management, and solidarity and care when using the digital technologies. In all of these 5 action areas, social science and natural science can play important roles, together with faith communities and the church. In this set of action areas, solidarity makes a big difference. Facilitating collective action is critical for all of them. Religious communities can be important in that. Science and faith can and must together address the paradox that I have outlined at the beginning. The paradox between solidarity so much at the micro level, so little at the global and international level. So much failure of solidarity at the global level must no longer be put up with. Science and faith need to engage. Thank you for your attention.